Welcome to the Revillaging podcast, a podcast addressing eco-grief, eco-anxiety, and other forms of climate crisis, and then connecting it to tangible solutions we can all take to become more resilient. 3 pieces of media that lit me up this January. So I wanted to talk about some pieces that I was just really excited, inspired, or in awe of that I have consumed this past January. So the first media piece that I want to cover was something that I came across on a podcast. This is also where I'm hosting my platform, which is Anchor, and also Spotify. And the piece that I found is called Disinformation, Greenwashing, and Divestment by Naomi Oreskes. And I was just so lit up and inspired by hearing this courageous woman, very knowledgeable and well-read, speak about the climate crisis. And really, I think she's covering something that's really important, especially from a historic and scientific perspective. I do, as someone that is in the green eye, or, am known for talking about environmental and very liberal subjects, to be frank, alternative, but still liberal. And then seeing like a lot of my friends from both sides, very libertarian or liberal, and wanting more and more autonomy with everything that's going on. I find like I really am in awe of this woman who is in the scientific eye and is just trying to deliver like information that's historically accurate and scientific. So that's why I'm really excited by what she's saying, because it's a perspective, one, that is of an elder, someone that has done the work, and is not just saying like, oh, I want my freedom, like this is what I think we should be doing, or like two sides of the same coin, in my opinion. So what I'm really trying to say is I find this woman is very courageous because she's talking about disinformation of the climate crisis, and really the disinformation coming from the fossil fuel industry and marketing to really deny these scientists and scare them and tell them that, what they're saying is inaccurate, their life work is not important, and that they're the ones who's scamming. This is the fossil fuel industry. And so this podcast goes into detail. It's only 30 minutes long, and honestly, it felt like no time at all. It's so important for us to be listening to this information from this type of perspective. So I just want to read you a quote that I heard her say. Politically, I'm afraid climate change will be used as an excuse by authoritarians to try to gain more power and further undermine democracy. Crises can be exploited. Dictators can use fear to give up their basic human rights. That is how she starts the podcast. That is courage for me. This is something that if you talk about publicly, that's, something you will be attacked for. I'm obviously talking about it publicly, but, I think that she's a very well-known figure, and I frankly hope that people are listening to her. It's not something that I have talked about publicly before. It is definitely part of why I am finding ways to be more resilient and to be open. I am afraid of that. Part of my eco-grief is understanding powers that be that don't have our best interest at heart. And that's really hard, you know. I'm not necessarily talking about COVID, although I do find that's a weaving aspect. But since I've been 19 years old, almost for 10 years, I've had like this great distrust in our political system, our governmental system, and much more real, our corporations. In the US, that is what we're run by, is corporations, you know, and I'm preaching to the choir, I understand that. But for her to speak out and say that it's because of corporations that are, you know, not doing our best interest and have billions of funding, and that they're one in threat by scientists giving real information, and that they are then part of this marketing scheme is that they are blaming the government. And that's really interesting that she goes into it. Now, I'm not saying, you know, I'm pro or anti-government. That's not what I'm talking about right now. I'm not pro or anti-corporations. Again, not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a very specific scheme that is hurting our basic rights and hurting our climate crisis affecting today, and also our future. So yeah, I am above elated, and she is the one that has excited me to talk about this matter. So yeah, number 1, Disinformation, Greenwashing, and Divestment by Naomi Oreskes. Number 2, so I have this book. It's called From What Is to What If. And the fine print here is Unleashing the Power of Imagination to Create the Future We Want. And you might recognize the name Rob Hopkins. He's someone that I'm very interested in. I do really appreciate his work. I do think that he has a very white perspective and European perspective that not necessarily everyone has access to, but he has created the transition town movement. And then there are people of color that then created the just transition movement to incorporate more of a diversity and more, you know, forms of accessibility to this type of movement, which is transition towns is a resilient town, or the movement to create a resilient town. And I think a lot of what they're saying can appear far-fetched, but what I really love about Rob Hopkins is that he makes really tangible handbooks and steps to get to organizing and talking to your neighbors about small actions, and then painting a really nice future that everyone actually wants to participate in. And so, you know, I haven't talked about that much on this podcast yet, but I do find that the solution piece is critical. And so what he goes into, and why I'm really excited about this book, is using imagination as that tool. And that's something that I realized early on also in this process, is like taking back power. And a lot of what that is feeling into imagination. I think a lot of, and he also talks about this as well, anxiety and grief comes from like this lack of creativity, and the more anxiety and grief you feel, the less artistic you feel. You feel depressed, you don't feel like you want to do things. Yet if you start singing, you start dancing, you start telling jokes, you start painting, or just writing, and or, you know, even or imagining, just letting yourself imagine, taking a break and being like, you know, what is it that I want? And so that's something that I've incorporated into my practices. Who do I want to be, and what type of world do I want to see? And Rob Hopkins has really helped me get further. So in this book, he talks about that on a children's level and an adult's level. And he also talks about different exercises we can take and why it's so necessary during this climate crisis that we really need to take the imagination tools back and start weaving it into our daily lives as a forum or a tool to organize movements. So I think that's super critical. And another piece I want to bring into is the solar punk ideology, which is very, I think, from what is to what if, is very imaginary. And the way that I explain the new solar punk ideology is, if you were to read your child a bedtime story and you read as if, this book is about the future, and it's a very this is how it's going to be, right? It's a fairy tale, but it's like, yeah, this is how it's going to happen. And it's reading about renewable energies and resiliency and people living together in a very happy or utopian future, but really in the foundations and values of being resilient and being regenerative and having purpose and passion going into our future. And, notice I'm talking about a children's book and a fairy tale, yet I don't think we have enough of those. And what is really interesting about the solar punk movement is that it captures a wide audience, and it, again, is more passionate and imaginative. I really love the graphics that have been produced. I really recommend checking out what solar punk is. But yeah, I think it's this imaginative, anarchist, could be vegan, whatever you want to call it, but regenerative movement that's slightly different than permaculture or weaving in permaculture, but in more of this space of imagination and creation that we so direly need right now. So that was number 2. Number 3 is slightly a different subject, but for me is intertwined, which is Wild Coubtry. And this is about a cult. It is a 6-part documentary series on Netflix. I told myself that I'm not going to watch that much Netflix in 2022, but I couldn't resist watching this with my partner. It's about Bhagwan Rajneesh, and he's also known as Osho, and his secretary, Ma Anand Sheila. And these two powerful people have been in the eye of media throughout the 80s, and I don't understand why my generation or many people that I've talked to have never heard of this person or what has happened. This is a group, a movement, the Osho movement of 500,000 people throughout the world. This is $1 million business or industry, and this is a city that was formed in Oregon. And for someone that is deeply involved in the intentional and eco-village movement, I find that I'm shocked that I haven't heard about it, that my partner hasn't heard about it. And no, I'm not saying that I want to be this cult, but I think that it really brought up a lot of interesting things and similarities to what the eco-village movement faces. There was a lot of backlash in the documentary from very conservative people, and I think that ultimately Sheila, which was the spokesperson for this, I think there was 10,000 people plus at the community itself. And I think she was very outrageous. She tried to be very outrageous. She talked about sex consistently. She, flicked off media cameras. And I think more so was trying to get the point across and, reach a very specific market audience. But I honestly don't necessarily agree with the way that she presented. I don't agree with a one leader mentality or mindset leading a community. In my opinion, I don't find that's what an intentional community is. If there's one person making, or two people, or a select few making the majority of decisions for people's autonomy, I don't agree with those things. But what I find super interesting is that they used the constitutional rights to form a city. And they did all of this by the ballot system. They did, everything that they did in the US, they did it lawfully and legally. So I find their practices and the way they use law very interesting, because I do think a lot of intentional communities can learn from that. I do think that we can create our own cities, and I think we can create them out of love and value systems that we are aligned with. So, yeah, I think that they brought a lot of valid things. I think that they prioritized too many other things like sex and being out there. And, I think they could have gotten along with their neighboring towns a little bit more. Although, they were people of color, they were Indian leaders. And they did have, a largely white following, but they, Osho is from India, Sheila is from India. They gave them all Indian or different, spiritual sounding names. And that scared a lot of people in and of itself. And they did bring up a lot of incongruencies around, Utah and the Mormons, and how they have created cultish followings, yet they're still existing, and a lot of different other Christianity, and saying how government is separate from religion, and that's not the case at this community, blah blah blah, because they were a certified religion. They went through that process as well. So, yeah, I think, politically, there was a lot of incongruencies with, charges that they were facing on a legal level. And, yeah, I just find their work and their success and ultimate failures to be very interesting. So, I would definitely recommend watching Wild Coubtry on Netflix. And thanks for listening to my podcast.